Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Sveiki Vilnius. Every time I come back to my hometown and my most beloved town in the world, I'm really impressed about the progress. Sometimes it's difficult to see that when you live here, but it's really incredible. And I think a lot has been said yesterday about this, how much we have achieved as a country and also as a region. At the same time, now we have this good dilemma: what's next for us? And that's not only for Lithuania and the Baltics, it's for the world as well. And how we're going to continue growing, how we're going to continue prospering. And I would like to share some of insights, maybe first of all, what is happening globally when it comes to energy and how energy market is developing. And then what does that mean for Lithuania and for the Baltics in terms of independence? And what is independence? What is energy independence? So let me start first of all with the good news. The good news is that energy consumption overall, energy demand overall in the world is growing. Why this is a good news? Because at the same time we have a climate crisis, right? So we should consume less. The good news is that in the whole history of humanity, it was very clear correlation between how much do we grow as a civilization and energy consumption since pre-Roman times. There were some exceptions. COVID, by the way, was one of those exceptions. Some of the big wars, there were exceptions, but from the rest of our history, as much as we grew as humanity, our energy consumption was growing as well. The good news, we expect this to grow, especially in electricity, because we expect a lot of electrification based on different estimates between 50 to 100% growth in the next couple of decades. Why growth is good? Because first of all, growing market attracts investment, attracts innovation, attracts talent, attracts new technologies. So growth is good, and that means growth is also good for our global climate change, because the more innovation we get, the more technology, more capital, then the chances are we will find better solutions. At the same time, and this is really tough moment for us as a humanity, we are still very schizophrenic about the climate change. We have a lot of almost bipartisan views in terms of we need to drive for the net zero and future without carbon or with limited carbon, or at least without CO2 in the atmosphere. But at the same time, governments are still very much divided. Are they going to use carrot or stick? And how this energy transition will be supported. And as a result, investors are also lost. Because if I want to spend capital on the renewables, and renewables generate 5% return, while at the same time conventional oil and gas generates 12%, then it's quite a difficult dilemma to sort out. We're talking about carbon, but we still don't have a global carbon market. You have carbon price in Europe, which is quite transparent. You have some of the regional signals in US. You have a market in China, which is completely opaque. So if you have something that you cannot even price, how do you invest in the carbon capture? For example, how you're going to get the returns? Not everything is doom and gloom. What we saw, especially during the last 12 months or so, that there is a lot of drive to come up with new tools that would help investors to direct the capital into the areas that require most of a change. Again, renewables being one of them. I think one of the very good examples was last year when almost everyone who was working on blue and green hydrogen 12 months ago, maybe 18 months ago, was thinking mostly about Europe and Asia. And last summer, suddenly everybody shifted their attention to US. And now if we look at the largest projects, especially in blue hydrogen, they are mostly US focused. Carbon capture and storage, mostly US focused. What happened? What was different? Just one change, which is called IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, which set up very clear guidelines how investors can get their returns in they invest in those still tricky, still risky technologies. Unfortunately, at the same time, we see that Europe and the rest of the world is still falling behind. They're still trying to figure out how they're going to support that transition. And again, is it more a carrot or is it more a stick? So if we look from a capital perspective, I think we will see some very interesting developments in the next few years. First of all, we see a lot of capital being spent on what we call no regret. There are a lot of regions where if you invest in the renewables, you know what is your return. Yeah, maybe it's not double-digit return, but it's still a return. At the same time, we still don't know how to deal with inflation. Some of you may have read the recent news from yesterday that the auction for the new offshore wind in UK has been cancelled because no one turned out and submitted their bids. Why? Because the cost of building solar, wind, other renewables during last year and a half increased by 40 to 60%. So some of the developers who invested into this a couple of years ago with different prices, they are really struggling with those projects. Let me now turn into independence. What is independence? And Roland, as he's famous for describing in one sentence very, very complex issues, he almost did that. So first of all, when we speak about independence, first of all, we start with security of supply. Can I get what I need when I need it? And Lithuania was a shining example last year when everybody was struggling, what do we do without Russian gas? Lithuania said, by the way, we already have our LNG terminal. And it happened the same 20 years ago with Būtingė and with famous story with Russian oil. So security of supply, do I have different sources to get my energy in? Now, one important fact is that Baltics overall and Lithuania are still predominantly dependent on fossil fuels. 85% in Lithuania, which is higher, by the way, than the world's average. So more than 85% of what we consume in Lithuania, everyone, industry, all of the residents, is imported by definition. It's a fossil fuels. We don't have our own fossil fuels, or at least those with very, very few and small exceptions. So what does it mean? That we need to have a very reliable infrastructure for us to get access to those resources. And again, LNG terminal is a very good example. We can import our oil, we can import our gas into Lithuania. Now, what about electricity? We import 2/3 of electricity in Lithuania. So that takes us to the second area, which is resilience. How resilient is this infrastructure? If suddenly that cable is dysfunctional, if suddenly Scandinavia is saying, we have a problem, we have a drought, we don't have enough hydro, can we still get what we need? And the history shows that things happen. The black swans or great swans, they happen. And you may have a moment when your best neighbor, your best friend, forget Russia, your best friend may say, I cannot supply, I cannot do this, I still need to prioritize my own industry. And this is what we've seen, what was happening in Europe during COVID times and also last year, that when things happen, when you have a real crisis, it's still very much up to national government and the country sorting out itself and prioritizing its own industry and its own society versus the rest. So when it comes to resilience, there is still a lot to do in terms of infrastructure, interconnectance, and we know that these programs are being set up, they're being launched, both in terms of interconnectivity when it comes to the high voltage. We need to think what about our LNG and what about our oil terminals and how that is going to work in the future. But the part of resilience equation cannot be resolved completely without also looking into what Lithuania can actually produce and make on its own soil. And of course, current answer is renewables, and this is why we see a lot of excitement about that. Now, at the same time, where we need to be cautious with the growth of renewables, again, Europe is very much falling behind US. It's still, in terms of overall renewables penetration, it's still a little bit ahead, but when you look at the growth, it's falling behind. And by the way, Lithuania is not an exception, and Baltics is not an exception. So how much more the country can invest, and then what does it mean for the overall energy system? Hydropump storage, if we look in the future, the more intermittency we introduce, again, wind, solar, the more balancing power we're going to need. So pump storage, like Kruonis, can we double it? Can we triple it? Maybe not. Environmentalists, they may have their own view. Can we buy some batteries from Mr. Musk and use them for balancing? These are the answers that we will need to have very, very soon, because you cannot continue investing into renewables without actually fixing the rest of the system. And fixing the rest of the system is not only the balancing, but it's also the wires and the copper that we will need to put in the ground. If all of us, we want to switch to EVs, it will not be a problem with availability of EVs and batteries. It will be a problem of availability of copper. How much cables we will need to put on the ground. So these are quite significant investments that the region will need to make in order to address security of supply and resilience. But then at the same time, we can address all of this. But if our energy costs too much, if we're not competitive versus other regions, we're not independent. Why we're not independent? Because we're going to lose our talent, our industry, our businesses. They will move. They're mobile. We were hearing before the lunch from people, very successful entrepreneurs, how global they are already. So competitiveness is one of the key elements of independence. And you can have the best access to LNG, but if you don't have trading capability, you will have a result that Lithuania is facing right now. We have gas, no doubt. But are we paying for the gas the same as other countries are paying in Europe? Unfortunately not. So building new capabilities, again, like trading capability, and figuring out the markets, and figuring it out how we can make energy also competitive, and how we can make industry competitive. And here, unfortunately, the solution cannot come just from Lithuania or just from the Baltics. We're very much dependent on the rest of the world, and especially on EU. What we're seeing now that when it comes to total energy cost, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the play was very straightforward and very clear. Europe, when it comes to energy cost, was more competitive than Asia. This is why Europe could compete industry-wise against Asia. It was a little bit more expensive than US, but just by a little bit. Now, last year, that started changing, and quite significantly. Last year, Europe paid 400 billion euros more than US for energy, for that amount of energy that Europe consumes, both consumers and the industry. Now, again, governments, they chipped in. And hopefully, depending how the winter evolves, hopefully this will not be 400 billion this year, because we saw that the gas prices and oil prices were lower than they were last year. But that's still a very significant amount. How long we can continue to be competitive as a region, as a wider region, because we're already, in terms of energy cost, we're already on par with Asia. So those industrial champions of Europe who still had an advantage just 2 years ago, 3 years ago, they don't have that advantage anymore. US is addressing that by doubling down both on renewables, but also new technologies. Again, if I decide to invest in carbon capture and storage, I can expect that this business will generate already a sufficient return on US soil. The blue hydrogen, very similar story. Green hydrogen, probably we will need another 5-7 years before that happens. And this is very much subsidy-driven. Unfortunately, this is very much subsidy-driven. Europe spends not a small amount of money, around 70 billion per year, on energy subsidies. But then how it is spent, if we give a subsidy for someone to buy EV, and that EV is produced in China and battery sourced from China, does it really create competitiveness? These are kind of questions that we all, the region, and including Lithuania, we will need to address in the coming years. So how we can be competitive, and at the same time, how we can ring-fence ourselves for the future. Again, the good news is that with the energy transition, we are all more or less, as a humanity, in the first mile. We still don't know what is the ultimate solution that we're going to have. We don't know if the nuclear is still part of the equation. Seems that gas will be very much a transitionary fuel, and it is part of the equation, at least for the next probably decade or couple of decades. It seems that Solar and wind are still having a good ride, but again, with low margins. The big question is hydrogen, and I think some of that was discussed before the break. And I know there was a lot of excitement about the hydrogen. Truth to be told, hydrogen also creates a new challenge for the industry, because before, the way we were investing oil, gas, electricity was very focused individual investments. We have offshore rig, we have a nuclear power plant, we have something else. The way the investments are going to evolve in the new system will be very much integrated. There is no sense to start building green hydrogen plant if I don't have a close industrial player there, an off-taker. Because we still don't know how to transport liquid hydrogen effectively. It's too expensive. It's loss-making. So that means also the way we make decisions and the way Lithuania makes decisions in terms of where we want to invest from the energy perspective is no longer, we should have our energy utility figuring that out. This should be a dialogue with the industry, because this is how this is going to work in the future, especially in terms of the new technologies. So let me try to conclude on the independence. First of all, Lithuania and the region already passed some very tough tests during last 18 months. And some of them were flying colors, especially when it comes to security of supply. Europe, it seems, is also figuring this out. There is still a lot of investments to be made from a resilience perspective, and especially when it comes to balancing. If we want to double or triple our renewables portfolio, again, 1 Kruonis will not be enough. And 1 Tesla battery will not be enough. You need much more sizable investment, a much more complicated investment. New technologies like hydrogen, it will be impossible to execute without close collaboration with key industrial players and off-takers. But all of this is heavily, heavily dependent on the subsidies. And we should make no mistake, this is the new competition that we see globally. I was, by the way, expecting that in the previous speech from WTO, we will hear about this as well, because the way regions and countries compete, one of the key elements there is tariffs. And what we see right now with the CBAM, cross-border adjustment mechanism, being introduced, and with subsidies being allocated on the investments that are based on the national soil, this is just a form of tariff, a form of a support that you can make to your local industry. So we will see a lot of that evolving and developing in the next couple of years. And that can change completely, again, as we saw with IRA, that can change completely any business plans that anyone is writing right now. Whatever you are planning to invest into today may change in the blink of an eye if we see a new mechanism coming out in EU or in other parts of the world that will compete for the same capital and for the same money. The good news for Lithuania is again, that we have a clean slate. We don't have too much of incumbent generation when it comes to electricity and incumbent infrastructure. We are already decommissioning our nuclear power plant. We don't have significant mining assets that we would be dependent on. So we can start with a clean slate, and we can invest also into some of the new technologies. But again, this will be very much driven and very much impacted by the new subsidies and new support mechanisms that will be coming out. And that means we will need to compete for the attention of the global capital. And right now, US is winning in that area. Thank you very much, and looking forward to a panel discussion.